Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm preaching. Working hard this morning, I must say, working hard. Now, you know that new song that we did? I've got to let you into a little confession. That little, we worship you with the rap in the middle. I wrote that song. And in the, well, you say that, but it says, I wonder who's preaching. I hope it's not boring. That's me. I'm like, that has badly backfired. Or not. Well, let's find out. So I hope you can stay with me, and I'm preaching. So, today we start a new series called Cross Vision, looking at the cross of Jesus as we head towards Easter next month. And so over the next coming Sundays, we're going to be kind of reflecting on the cross together. And so today we're reflecting on the cross and the theme of ransom that we see in the cross. And actually the act of Jesus dying on the cross is central to the belief and the faith of Christians. And it's a non-negotiable in understanding about the faith of Jesus. And yet, Jesus' work on the cross, why did he die on the cross? What did it do? Why did he have to do it? What's happened because of it is a rich and complicated thing. And we're only going to look at one part of that, one sort of angle, I suppose, on the cross. Let me give you an example. Jesus was our ransom, which we're going to be unpacking and looking at. But he was also our Passover lamb. The Bible speaks of Jesus being a sacrifice, a Passover lamb. He was our Savior. He's actually the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. He's a mediator between God and man. He defeated Satan. He sought that which was lost. He gave us victory. He's accomplished our redemption. He's made purification for our sins, paid our debt, abolished death, and brought life and immortality. He brought about the reconciliation of all things. He asked God to forgive us. He delivered us over for us. He became a curse for us and summed up everything in himself. That's an impressive job description. And he did it. And so as we look at Jesus, what does it mean that Jesus has saved us? What has he done on the cross? We're just looking at one angle, but I'd really encourage you maybe in these coming weeks as we meditate and reflect on the cross, that our prayer would be that God really speaks to you again in a new and fresh way. Whether maybe you've been following Jesus for a long time, or maybe for you, you're still exploring who this Jesus person is, that actually as we look at the cross, we would again see something of a revelation of who God is. And yet it's interesting that for Christians, many of us have crosses or wear crosses. The cross was a Roman invention, and it was a brutal and cruel torture instrument. It'd be a bit like us wearing like electric chairs, little electric chairs on our necklaces. Like it's that, but worse, and we've become so kind of accustomed to it. And I think we've lost in some ways the shockingness of what the cross did. It was the way that the Romans, in governing over huge areas and countries, would bring peace by cruelly oppressing and putting down anyone who disagreed with them. They call it the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome would be kept because, well, they would kill you. And they'd do it, and they would show everyone, and this is what happens. So even in Israel, the history of Israel, there have been many crucifixions, many suppressions put down, thousands of people even being crucified in one go. People knew what crucifixion meant. And so for Jesus, who was claiming to be the Messiah, the anointed one of God to free Israel, God's people, a Messiah on the cross doesn't look like the kind of Messiah who won, but actually that failed. There's really no Messiah at all if the Romans were going to crucify you. So we're going to read just for one verse in Mark 10. It's Mark 10:45. It's a simple little verse that comes actually at a key point in the Gospel of Mark. It says, "For even the Son of Man," that's how Jesus referred to himself, "did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is a key passage in Mark where just at the end of chapter 8 and then 9 and then again in 10, Jesus has said explicitly 3 times to his disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be handed over, flogged, beaten and killed, and on the 3rd day I will rise. And the first time that happens, it's to Peter, who can't believe it and disagrees with him, and Jesus rebukes him sternly. But Mark works it 3 times because this is the hinge in the gospel, as then this narrative now takes us towards Jerusalem. So Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem as he's saying this. He knows what's going to happen. He understood his mission. And so in a way, this was his mission statement. I have come not to serve, not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many. What did Jesus mean when he just talked about himself in that manner, to be a ransom for many? Where does the idea of ransom come from? So I just want to unpack a little bit of this ransom thinking as we look at the cross. And then what does that mean for us today? Well, actually, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's lots of examples of ransom. The word ransom, I suppose a definition would be to release someone, to free someone by means of payment. And actually the word to redeem someone is very similar to that. So sometimes God talks about redeeming people, but ransom is about buying people back. There's a transaction that's gone on. Now, there's a number of places where we see this working out, and a couple of them in the book of Exodus. Now, one of them is if you have an ox, a beast, and it's gored someone, then that's not good. But if that beast kills someone else, then the owner is in big trouble and they need to be killed. Unless, it says in Exodus 21:30, unless they have a ransom imposed on them, a price put on their head instead of death. And then if someone can pay that ransom, they'll be free, and if they can't, they'll be killed. In fact, there's a census that God takes at the end of Exodus, and he asks every Israelite to give half a shekel as a ransom for their life. I don't really understand what that means, but I just looked up ransom and I found lots of references. I won't read them all to you. These are just the good ones. Actually, there's a story, you might know it, of Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat, the brothers. There's a pivotal bit where Benjamin, the oldest brother, who's really significant, when they look at getting rid of Joseph and they stick him in a well, he actually says, no, put me in there instead. I'll be a ransom for him. Put me in his place instead. Take me and let him live. But they didn't. And it's happened if people get into poverty in families, again, in the Leviticus book of the Bible, which has lots of laws and codes around how they orientate society. They would say this, that if any of your kin fall into difficulty and one of them sells themselves, then once they've sold themselves, they have the right to redemption, to be bought back. One of their brothers may redeem them, or their uncle or son. And we see this actually working in the story of Ruth and Boaz, a kinsman redeemer, a family member who redeems and buys us back. So the Bible, it speaks a lot of it, of this ransom idea. But why did Jesus see his life as a ransom for many? Why a ransom, and to whom? And this is where, again, I need to give a bit of a sweep, I think, of the story, the arc of the story of the Bible, in order to understand what Jesus was doing when he arrived. Right back in the beginning, the first book of the Bible, Genesis, it's all going well for 2 chapters. But in Genesis 3, it goes wrong. And it's the event that we call the fall, where the snake, representing Satan, a demonic power and demonic force, tempts Adam and Eve. And they give in to that temptation. They eat an apple. Big deal. They ate some fruit. But actually, it was the one thing that God said they must not do, is to eat from this tree. And yet they did. What has that got to do with anything? This is the key thing. Lots of people think that the sin of Adam and Eve was to be disobedient. Sin is disobedience because they didn't do what God said. And that's true. That happened. We see it in that moment. But there's something more profound, I think, going on. The way that God set up ruling with Adam and Eve and mankind was to rule with them. We were there. We are to be co-rulers with God, to bring his rule and reign here on earth, to do his will, to be actually vice-regents with him, to do God's will. When there was sin, when there was an abdicating to, I suppose, that authority, it's actually about ruling that they opted out of. The decision to sin was actually a decision not to rule as God had asked them to. It was actually an opting out of carrying the responsibility of ruling with God. And I think this is a profound issue, that when this happened, it meant that humanity then came under the rule of a demonic power, of Satan, as the Bible speaks of it. Actually, no longer were they ruling as God had intended, but actually humanity was being ruled by another power, by a demonic force. We see this in Jesus' life, in his temptation in Matthew 4, when he goes out to the wilderness and he's tempted by the devil. It says this, the last temptation in Matthew 4, Jesus is the devil says, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world if you worship me. How can he say that? He can say it because he has them. He can say it because he is the ruler of the world in a way that's been given over. And Jesus understood that, and he resisted that temptation. And as we see, what he goes on to do in the cross wins back that rule for us. Jesus was to buy back humanity from the devil, to rescue them and free them. Now, this ransom idea, sometimes analogies only go so far. That even the early church fathers really got hold of this ransom theology, this ransom idea. How did it work? Who was paying who? Did God have to be paid back through Jesus back to God? No, that's not how it works. What was the devil paid by Jesus? Did he receive something? No, it doesn't. In fact, Jesus was really clear. The devil doesn't have any hold over him. He says that in 1430s. It comes in John 1430s. It comes to that time as he goes to the cross. Says that the devil has no hold in me. It's really clear that actually Jesus was a ransom, something that was paid in order to free us. But it wasn't like the devil was then being paid and had loads of money or something. Because actually that's where it broke down. In Acts 26, when Jesus is speaking to Paul, the commission for Paul is this: to open their eyes, people's eyes, turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and place among those who are sanctified. There's this idea that there's a moving of kingdoms from the kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. And so humanity has been held captive by Satan. And the reason is we've colluded them with him. Right back in the garden, that idea of the fall there. But actually we've all colluded, we've all sinned and fallen short. We've all colluded with the powers. But Jesus speaks about the strong man, saying, I will bind the strong man. There's something that Jesus knew, that he would be taking on Satan and defeating him. So how are we held captive? We're held captive in a number of ways. We're held captive by death, spiritually and physically. An outworking of sin that we're all in is that we're held captive with it. And I suppose in understanding this ransom idea, we can say that Jesus has paid a price for us. Jesus has come and given his life for us, and in doing so frees us. And I guess there's been lots of thought about it. Do you know the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe story? It's a ransom theology that goes on with Aslan, who gives his life in the place of Eustace. That's really what's going on. There's this exchange that's happening. And actually, there's been many other ways of understanding Jesus' death on the cross, or what we call the atonement. But this ransom idea is an early one, and I think it has a valid place. So I want to give you a little run-up, I suppose, of why Jesus was a ransom, and how does that work for us today? I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to go back into the Old Testament and the key story, the pivotal thing of the Old Testament, which is the Exodus, which is the freeing of Israel as a nation from Egypt. Now, actually we've even mentioned it, Joseph and his brothers, they get saved, they end up living in Egypt. Then that family, that tribe grows and becomes a nation in Egypt, but they're slaves. They're subject to a tyrannical ruler, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. And so they cry out to God. And what does God do? God raises up a deliverer in Moses. And there is a battle. There's a battle of kingdoms, of powers, the power of Pharaoh and Egypt, and the battle of God and his power and his people. And so actually God says in Exodus 6 verse 6 that he will redeem his people from Egypt. Literally he will pay for them and get them out. Did Pharaoh get any money? No. It's just an expression, this idea of I'm gonna pay for them to bring them out and win them over. But interestingly, God doesn't just get them out of Egypt and they go, right, see you then. I got you out, off you go. See you later. Have you noticed he hasn't done that? But he then stays with them. Something else goes on. He doesn't just call them out of Egypt and free them from there, but he calls them into something. God becomes their king. And in doing so, they become his people. He sets up a covenant with 10 commandments and law that's given to help them in this new place. But they're given a new identity of a people of God. They're to live under his rule, his protection, his kingship. They're to be his people, and he is their God. But they're not just to do it, well, that's nice for them, but they're called to be a holy nation, to bring a blessing into the world to all nations. That's God's plan to bring freedom. So when we come to Jesus, I think Jesus has clearly in mind this Exodus story. I'm sort of zooming over it really quickly. In fact, Matthew writes it explicitly as he sets it up that Jesus escapes into Egypt. And Matthew, the writer, quotes Hosea saying, "Out of Egypt I have redeemed my son." And again, the writer of Hosea, the prophet, is a profound prophet that speaks actually the whole story of redemption with his wife. So in the Gospel of Matthew, and I think for Jesus' own thinking, he's really clear that he's going to enact a new Exodus. Who's the tyrannical ruler? Is it Pharaoh? No, it's Satan. What's the problem? What's the slavery? We're enslaved to sin. Not just making bricks in Egypt, but we're enslaved to one who has bound us and caught us. And actually, we're enslaved to death itself and the power of death. And so Jesus understood this, that as he was going to enact it out, that's why the Last Supper is on Passover. Of all the festivals to choose, he didn't choose the Day of Atonement. He chose Passover. He said, I'm going to enact a new Passover to bring a new freedom. But the price that's going to be paid is me. I'm the sacrificial lamb. It's in my blood that by my death that you will be freed. I am paying the cost. The sinless one is being offered up. And he freely gave it as a ransom. As I stand in your place, others will go. In fact, throughout history, there's been examples of people who have given their lives in place of others to free people. I know there's a famous Holocaust one of a priest who took a place for a child. And I'm sure there's many other examples that I won't try and think up right now. So what happened? That Jesus was a ransom, but for the devil, Jesus was too strong. Actually, he didn't have a claim on Jesus. Actually, Jesus was able to defeat Satan and the powers on the cross. It says in Colossians, and Jesus, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. And so in this ransom thing that's gone on, this transaction, there's a freedom from the power of darkness that in Jesus' death has found us. But there's something else. It's for new life and a loyalty to God. It's not just being freed, but it's being for as well. It says, he rescued us from the dominion of darkness, brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And so what do we see in this victory? We see slaves being freed, and we see an enemy being defeated. I don't know if you're fans of the Antiques Roadshow at all. Have you ever seen it where someone brings an item and it's just some like old bowl that they just kind of keep the keys in or something, and they just brought it in, and then they find out it's like a Ding Ministry incredible bowl that's like worth 3 million. Did you miss that one? I might have slightly made it up, but this idea that really horrified. Like, oh my gosh, we've just been keeping the keys in it all this time, and it's like really valuable and really precious. No one would have thought it. It's really interesting for Jesus when he says, I've given my life for you. Do you know what that means? It means you are incredibly valuable. Paul writes to the church in Corinthians, says, you're not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. It changes how you view yourself when you realize that actually it's not just any price, but the price of Jesus himself that has given his life for you. It makes you think, okay, maybe I am worth something. If that's something you've struggled with around your own identity and self-worth. But more than that, it spills up. Every person you see is of incredible value and worth because Jesus died for them and paid a price for them. It upholds and honors every human that God knows and has made and loved by sending his son. So Jesus has paid for us and freed us. How are we to live out this freedom? It says in Galatians, Christ has redeemed you from the curse of the law, freed from the powerful force of the law, not destroying it, but freeing them to the law of Christ. So the cross doesn't just illustrate the character and nature of God and his perfect character fully displayed in Jesus on the cross, but it's also the perfect illustration of what the character of God's children should have as well. Self-sacrificial love revealed in the cross isn't just the love that God shows to us, but that we are to extend to others, that we are to live out. We're called to live the way of the cross, a way of a self-sacrificial love. We're to put the character of God on display by how we care for others, living the way of the cross, to sacrifice our lives for the benefit of others. And so that's what we're called to. And so, in summary, this ransom idea is through the theme, all through the Bible. And Jesus understood it. I want to give my life and put myself in your place that you can be free. That actually the ultimate word is God's. That death no longer has the ultimate victory. That although we will physically die, that we'll be alive to him. Actually sin, the curse of sin has been broken over us. We no longer have to sin, but we are a new people, a new creation, redeemed and called actually into the kingdom of Jesus, to then live for him, to live under his lordship, his goodness. Who wouldn't want to follow a king like that, who gave everything to love us and free us when we weren't able to save ourselves? And so that's some thoughts and some meditation on the idea of ransom and what we see in the cross. There's many other angles that we want to explore. And I'm going to pray for us now, and I'm then going to lead us in a time of worship. So Lord, thank you that when we look at the cross, we see you, Jesus, and we see an extraordinary price paid for us. A price paid to free us, to love us, to free us from the power of sin and death, and to restore us and to be children of God, loved and whole. I want to pray, Lord God, for us today, that you'd speak to us again through the cross. As we look to you, Jesus, would we, again, just be renewed in that truth? So I ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen.